It is good to be in the house of the Lord this morning. This morning, we're going to do some looking back. We preach a lot, we look a lot at the New Testament. It's easy sometimes for us to skip over the Old Testament. But the Old Testament has a lot of very important stuff in it. Just because we're now underneath the New Covenant does not take the Old Testament away. It does not make it any less important. As we were talking in Sunday school this morning, Jesus says in Matthew 22:40, upon these two commandments hinge the whole of the law and the prophets. In other words, he's talking about the Old Testament because when Jesus was alive, there was no New Testament yet. Yeah. Or you could say he was the New Testament. Now, that means this is still important, something that we need to continue to look at. 2 Timothy 3:16 tells us that all Scripture is inspired by the Word of God and good for sound teaching, doctrine, and reproof. Amen. So we can't ignore the Old Testament. Now we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 17 this morning. Now, I know this is a story many of us are very familiar with. We're talking about the story of David and Goliath. I was thinking about doing David and Goliath, and I didn't realize we were going to have so many young people in attendance last night, or maybe I was prepared a little bit more with a few visual aids, just due to the fact that it's something that's always good for the younger people. But it's a story that almost all of us are familiar with. Does that mean it's any less important to talk about it? By no means. Peter constantly is talking, and so does Paul. I know you already know this, but I remind you to stir you up. I'm reminding you of the story of David and Goliath. There's a lot of important parts to David and Goliath. Now, one of the first things I'll point out, and it's drawing from another passage rather than 1 Samuel 17, we're talking about David. David's an important person for us to understand because God says that David is a man after his own heart. That means David is somebody we really need to be able to understand who he is. Because isn't that one of the things that we as Christians want to be? That we want to be a man after God's own heart. Think of what a great compliment that is. To be able to be said that you are a man or a woman after God's own heart. David is a recorded instance that we actually get to see what was said. Maybe we should strive to have that heart ourselves. Now, in 1 Samuel chapter 17, we're looking at David when he's still young. Setting the stage for this, David roughly at this time, he's around maybe 12 years old. For all intents and purposes, everything in our society, we're going to consider him a child. So keep that in mind as we read this. David is still young. Now, picking up with 1 Samuel chapter 17. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Socoh, which belonged to Judah, and they camped between Socoh and Azekah in Ephes Dammim. That's the one thing about the Old Testament. You get a lot of these names and places that are really hard to pronounce. If you mispronounce them, don't worry about it. It's not the name that's important. Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and camped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array to encounter the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, while Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with the valley between them. Then a champion came out from the armies of the Philistines, named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span, and he had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was clothed with scale armor, which weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. He also had bronze greaves on his legs, and a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. The shaft of the spear was like a weaver's beam, and the head of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. His shield carrier also walked before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel and said to them, "Why do you come out to draw up in a battle array? Am I not the Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will become your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall become our servants and serve us." Again the Philistines said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. All right. Some of the things that we need to take into context in the historical setting here. We're talking about two armies getting ready to go into battle, into war. In a modern setting, this is a really confusing point to us to see a champion emerge from one army saying, "Hey, send your best men out to fight me. The winner of this will decide the battle." Rather than us wasting all of our men to die, my champion will challenge your champion, and we'll let this be the decision of the battle. Wouldn't battles be a lot better today if we actually still practice this? We could see two men fight rather than seeing thousands of men die. This was actually a custom in olden days. You can trace it back to even in the Greek stories. You'll see tales of Greek warriors facing off one-on-one against each other. Look at the legend of Achilles. You'll see it prevalent in the ancient world. So this is not something that was uncommon to the day, for a champion to come out and challenge champion of the other army. However, we do have to look at the fact that Goliath was a massive man. One thing that we can say, when you look a lot of times through history, the size of man has changed quite a bit over the years. Goliath, we're talking at this point, he's around 9 foot tall, somewhere in that neighborhood. He's a mountain of a man. Your average Jewish height at the time, short for our standards. They're about 5'5". So you've got a man that's basically twice the size of your average Israelite soldier. Saying, "Come out, fight me." By all intents and purposes, he's a giant. Even in today's standards, at 9 foot tall, we're going to consider Goliath a giant. Although probably in today's world, rather than him being a soldier, he'd be in the NBA. Yeah. But still, giant man. Now, Israel, I'm sure, had a champion. But it says all of the Israelites shook in fear. In other words, Israel's champion was like, I don't think so. Look at him. Me, him, I don't think that's going to happen very much. I'm going to go back home and maybe you all can sort this out. So Israel, rather than trusting in God, they're letting the size of this man intimidate them and scare them. Now, it's easy for us to kind of scoff and go, well, why didn't you trust in God? How many of us in this room are going to rely fully in our trust in God and walk toe-to-toe in battle against a 9 foot tall man with muscles as big around as our waist? I don't see any hands going up. So, can we really put the Israelites down for shaking in fear when we're saying, I don't think I'd walk out there myself? Let's continue on in the story. Now David was the son of the Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah, whose name was Jesse. And he had 8 sons. And Jesse was old in the days of Saul, advanced in years among men. The 3 older sons of Jesse had gone after Saul to the battle, And the names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and the second to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. Now the 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's flock at Bethlehem. The Philistine came forward morning and evening for 40 days and took his stand. Then Jesse said to David his son, "Take now for your brothers an ephah of the roasted grain and these 10 loaves and run to the camp to your brothers. Bring also these 10 cuts of cheese to the commander of their 1,000, and look into the welfare of your brothers, and bring back news of them. For Saul and they and all the men of Israel are in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines." For 40 days, this has been going on. You've got the Philistines on one hill, Israelites on the other, valley between them. Goliath keeps coming out every day. "Come on, send somebody to fight me. Let's just get this over with." But instead, Israel continues to be scared. Now, David, being the youngest of a small tribe, is going to check on his brothers. He has 3 brothers that are in Saul's army at the camp, counted in the number among the Israelites, that are too scared to take on Goliath. Too scared to take on this mountain of a man. So David arose early in the morning and left the flock with the keeper and took the supplies and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the circle of the camp while the army was going out in battle array, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines drew up in battle array, army against army. Then David left his baggage in the care of the baggage keeper and ran to the battle lines and entered in order to greet his brothers. As he was talking with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine from Gath, named Goliath, was coming up from the army of the Philistines, and he spoke these same words, and David heard them. When all the men of Israel saw the man, they fled from him and were greatly afraid. The men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who is coming up? Surely he is coming up to defy Israel, and it will be that the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel." Then David spoke to the men who were standing by him, saying, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living God?" The people answered him in accord with this word, saying, "Thus it will be done for the man who kills him." Now Eliab, his oldest brother, when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger burned against David, and he said, "Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your insolence and wickedness of your heart, for you have come down in order to see the battle." But David said, "What have I done now? Was it not just a question?" Then he turned away from him to another and said the same thing, and the people answered the same thing as before. David hears Goliath making these taunts. David's confused, shocked. Now everybody else is kind of fleeing from the battle in fear, and David says, "Who is this guy? Why are we fleeing? How does this person have the audacity? How does this person have this total lack of concern for God that he's willing to stand here and defy God's armies?" Now notice David's making a distinction here. When Goliath is calling out, he's calling out against Saul's army. Who among Saul's men. David said, you're God's people. Elohim, Adonai, El Elohim. In other words, the strong and powerful God. Master, God Most High in Hebrew. You are servants of Him. You are His people under His command. Yet you fear this mortal man. No, David doesn't look at him and see this big behemoth. David looks at him and sees an uncircumcised man of the world. Someone that is not of God's people. A stranger. He says, why are we, the children of God, afraid of Him? David's brother, Eliab, the oldest, he gets mad at this. But then again, it's your youngest brother, who's still not an adult, actually a child, has come to the battle, and he's like, hey, why are you cowering in fear over here? It's just a man. For some people, it's kind of like saying, hey, it's just a spider over there. You're God's people. Yes, looks big and scary, but it's still a spider that, with God's help, you can squish underfoot. Cowering in fear. When the words which David spoke were heard, they told them to Saul, and he sent for him. David said to Saul, let no man's heart fall on account of him. Your servant will go and fight with the Philistine. This child, 12-year-old child. Now, we've already talked that the average height of an Israelite is going to be about 5'5". Now, that's full-grown adult. We're talking about a 12-year-old boy. What? 4 foot, maybe 4.5 foot tall. He's a shepherd. So, he's not somebody that's in there lifting weights, bench pressing, big muscles. You've got a scrawny little 12-year-old boy. Says, King, don't worry. I'll kill him for you. Now, we question the faith of the Israelite army. We question the faith of Saul because they're all trembling in fear. Now, let me ask you this. Saul had to have some faith here. Saul had to have some serious faith here. Think about it. You've got this 9-foot-tall mountain of a man, huge muscles, heavy armor. Heck, the head of Goliath's spear probably weighed more than David. And Saul's like, okay, I'll let you be my champion. Now, if we take that into modern settings, and we've got this same challenge going on, and a 12-year-old walks out on the battlefield and says, I'll go out there and fight him for you. What's going to happen? Everybody's just going to laugh at him and say, go home. Get out of here. You're not fit for battle. You're not old enough. Go home. But Saul says, okay. Think about that for a moment. We question the Israelites' faith. But here, Saul is willing to put his faith in a 12-year-old boy. Scrawny. Not even a big burly boy. I know sometimes we look at some of the 12-year-olds that they say are 12-year-olds playing on a basketball team and say, that kid's got facial hair. He's 6 foot tall. No, not David. Scrawny, 4.5 foot tall boy. Then Saul said to David,
You are not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him. You are but a youth, while he has been a warrior from his youth. But then David said to Saul, your servant was tending his father's sheep when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock. I went out and attacked him and rescued it from his mouth. And when he rose up against me, I seized him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and may the Lord be with you. Then Saul clothed David with the garments and put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with armor. David girded his sword over his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. So David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. And David took them off. He took his stick in his hand and chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in the shepherd's bag, which he had even in his pouch, and his sling in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Now again, let's address this faith of Saul. Saul says, all right, I'm going to let you go in and be my champion. Let's put my armor on you, give you my helmet, give you my sword. Now keep in mind, David's still a child. This armor is not built for a child. Of course, it's built for a man. So it's not going to fit him right. It's going to make his movement encumbered. And David realizes this and says, you know, I can't wear this into battle. So he takes it off. Saul still lets him go. No armor, no sword. Lets him go into battle. I don't know about you, but to me, when I think about that, that's some serious faith there. Put that in modern terms, you've got that 12-year-old that says, I'll go out there and fight for you, but I can't hold this assault rifle. I can't wear this helmet. I can't wear this bulletproof vest. I'm going to go with my plain clothes, and I'm going to take this little sling and 5 stones against this guy over here who's heavily armored, carrying 2 AK-47s. And we're going to say, what? Go? Who among us would have that faith that that 12-year-old, no armor, just a stick and a sling can go out and do anything? If nothing else, stop and think of the faith that Saul's having, that he's not just going to be monumentally embarrassed. He's a king commanding an army of men. He's got thousands of strong soldiers standing here. What are the odds that this little boy he's sending out is going to be able to do anything? And you know, the moment that that kid emerges out there on the battlefield, the other army is going to die laughing. They've got a 9-foot-tall mountain of a man. They send out this little tiny boy. I'm sure pretty much anybody standing on that other side of the battlefield in Goliath's camp would almost consider it an insult that they would even send out such a scrawny little boy. What's he going to do? Did they send him out to polish Goliath's boots? That's what the other army's going to think. Then the Philistines came on and approached David with the shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, and ruddy with a handsome appearance. The Philistine said to David, Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine also said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field." Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you. I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." David again shows this strong faith. He's walking out against this mountain of a man. His knees aren't knocking. He's not shaking. He's not quivering. His voice isn't faltering. Well, at 12, he's in that adolescent stage. He may have that adolescent break of voice, but it's not a break or shake from fear. And Goliath taunts him, says, "Little boy, what are you doing? Do you think I'm a dog?" David looks back at him and lets his faith in God speak. Now, this is a clear and present example of how we need to face the problems in our lives. Now, that problem may not be a 9-foot-tall mountain of a man standing on a battlefield. But we have lots of problems, storms. We have our Goliaths in our lives. We need to approach them with the same faith David approached Goliath. Say, "God will deliver me from you. It's not by my hand, but by God's hand." Then it happened when the Philistine rose and came and drew near to meet David, that David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand into his bag and took from it a stone and slung it, and struck the Philistine on the forehead. And the stone sank into his forehead so that he fell on his face on the ground. Now, again, stop and think about this. This is something we are so familiar with, the story of David. Puts one little stone in the sling, swings it round and round, lets it fly, hits David in the forehead. There's something that we are forgetting in this picture. Goliath was wearing a helmet. So think of the accuracy of that shot. We oftentimes just let ourselves think that he's hitting a bare open forehead. Goliath was dressed for battle. He was wearing a suit of armor. In the beginning of the chapter, we had that suit of armor described to us. Scale armor, bronze helmet. There's a helmet there. And David still manages to land that shot on his forehead. God's hand guided that stone. Amen. If we were trying to compare that to modern accuracy, we would be talking of the legend of Vasily Zagsev in World War II, the Russian sniper, or Louis Hathcock, the sniper in Vietnam. But even their accuracy was with a well-sighted rifle, not a sling and a stone. Then David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him, but there was no sword in David's hand. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of his sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. Then the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, and they fled. the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistine as far as the valley and to the gates of Ekron. And the slain Philistines lay along the way to Sharim, even to Gath and Ekron. The sons of Israel returned from chasing the Philistine and plundered their camp. Then David took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his weapons in his tent. This little boy, not even an adult yet by Israel's standards, he had not reached bar mitzvah, still a child, faces down a mountain of a man, a skilled and trained warrior. Another analogy to pit this to you, it's like throwing a little 12-year-old boy in the middle of a UFC ring with a skilled MMA fighter. Chuck the Iceman Liddell. Maybe tossing them in the squared circle with Stone Cold Steve Austin. Maybe putting them in the ring with Floyd Mayweather Lewis. You get the picture. Putting this little boy, not trained in the ways of war, not trained in combat, going head to head, the massive person that is well trained, wearing armor. David wins. I guess our best analogy, we could put it into more of a modern terms. You're sending a 12-year-old boy out with just a small handgun facing down an enemy tank. And that one shot that the boy takes manages to go right through the turret into the tank. One shot to take down this huge, massive, overpowered thing by a little boy. That's faith. Now, that's the faith we need to have when we face down the problems in our lives. Now, when we look in the New Testament, Jesus tells us, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, be gone, and it will be gone. David had that faith. We need to strive to have that faith. We need to be like David and be a man after God's own heart. Now, that's all I have to say for this morning.